So now on to the job interview. Put in the chat if you have an interview lined up in the next couple weeks or so. Just say yes. How many people are taking this workshop because they have an interview coming up? Whoa, today. How many people have already had interviews and wish they would have done better? Cool. So those who have had interviews probably have different questions than those who haven't and those who are getting ready. But first off, I want you all to take and congratulate yourself for getting the interview, right? Oh, round three, cool. So many, so if you're getting an interview, that means you did what needed to be done with your resume and your cover letter. So you should congratulate yourself. You should treat yourself. You should shout with joy because I know an interview can be scary, the prospect of it, but you got that far, right? Whatever you did with your resume and your cover letter and your networking got you to that interview. So please keep in mind that getting to your interview means, Beth, put your question in the chat, please. Getting to that interview means that you are qualified for the job. It means that you have what it takes to get to do the job. You have met the minimum requirements and maybe more, and they feel you can do the job. Now they want to see if you're a good fit for the team, right? So you need to prep for your interview. And hopefully you've done some of this in the before. You've researched the job and the employer, and you know the skills that they needed because that's what you also addressed in your resume. You check your attitude and you look good, right? Those are all things that are important to do. And some of those things you should have done ahead of time. So researching the job and the employer can come first. Let's talk about researching the job. You can go to a couple different websites. You can go to Career One Stop and you can research that job and you can look at salaries. You can look at descriptions of what that job generally does. And that's helpful when after you just blow the interview out of the water and you get the offer, when they ask you about careeronestop.com. They ask you about salary, then you'll know the average or the range of salary for that type of position in your location. And the location is just as important as the type of job. What is the spelling? So we'll put it, Lana will put it in the chat. When you research the employer, there are multiple places you can go. You can go to LinkedIn. You can go to the employer's website. You can go to Glassdoor. It's really important to know as much about the employer as possible. And then could you put the onet.com also, Lana? As much about the employer as you can. You can know their mission statement. Sometimes they tell you, they even have a link to the person who's interviewing you. And if you know who's going to be on the interview panel, see if they have a LinkedIn page and learn as much about them as possible. There's nothing more embarrassing than asking a question at the end of their questions that you could have answered going to the company website. Know the company mission, know the company's priorities, know what the company does. Research it as much as you can and get as much detail as you can because that will also help you answer their questions. And then make sure that you know the skills that were asked for in the job posting. And in order to prep for that, which is probably would have been a good idea to do for the resume, and maybe you did, was to list point by point all the skills that are asked for in the job posting. And then so you take your paper, divide it in half, divide your word processing document in half. On one side, you list all the job requirements, preferred and required, point by point. And then in the other column, you list your stories. How can you demonstrate that you can do data entry? What did you do in a past job that shows that you have the ability to do accurate data entry, or that you have the ability to develop relationships? You should have point by point, and you should have more than one example if possible, because you never know the slant of the question they're going to ask. Also, you need to check your attitude for any type of interviews. And in the next slide, we'll learn about different types of interviews. You need to be positive. Nobody wants to add to their team a negative Nellie, and I'm sorry if your name is Nellie. Nobody wants to add someone who's not positive to their team. How many of you out there have had a job where you've worked with somebody who had a negative attitude? Just say yes or no in the chat. Right. And just think about what that experience was, working with somebody who was negative. Would you intentionally bring somebody onto your team that had a negative attitude? Would you want to work with that person every day? So what you're doing is you're trying to sell yourself as a team member. Remember, you've gotten the interview because you meet the requirements. So now they're looking for how you fit with the team. So the best thing you can do is be positive and display energy. That's what's important, right? And then you want to look good. If it's a virtual interview or if it's an in-person interview, and even if it's a phone interview, you want to set yourself up to be able to project your best image. So I mentioned the phone screening interview. Many employers do that. Sometimes it's the HR department and not the hiring manager. They'll call and they'll say, I would like to do a phone screening. If they call and it's not a good time and you're not prepared, it's totally reasonable and acceptable to say, I'm sorry, this isn't a good time. Can we schedule this? As an example, when I was looking for a job, I had applied for a job in August of one year, and I got a call back in October to do a phone screening interview. I had applied for many jobs between August and October, and I didn't even know right off the bat when they asked about the screening interview what job they were asking for. So I didn't even know how I would be answering the questions. So I just simply said, this is not a good time. Can we schedule it? Please let me know, I needed details, right? So what job was it? What company were they calling from? Because they didn't even introduce themselves when they called. You have control over the interviewing process. And when you do a phone interview, you want to make sure you're in a good place. So you're in a room that's quiet without distractions. You want to make sure that you have the job posting in front of you, or at least have reviewed it, reviewed the resume and the cover letter that you sent in for the job, and any research that you've done about the company. You want to come across competent. You also want to make sure you smile, because that comes across in how you answer questions. For the in-person screening, that can be virtual or that can be actually in person. I would say 85% of the time, maybe even 90, first in-person interviews are usually done virtually. Has anybody had an in-person interview for the first interview? Those of you who had interviews? Wow, quite a few. Yeah. So first we'll talk about the remote in-person. Make sure that your background is plain, right? It's best if it's just a blank wall, because people make judgments, people make assumptions about you. You are judged within the first 20 seconds of somebody seeing you. And it doesn't seem fair, but it's just a fact of how our minds work. What you look like, how your hair is, what your glasses are, what you're wearing, how much makeup, how little makeup, any jewelry. So keep everything to the minimum, everything nice and simple, and your background very simple. You might be a very devout religious person and have a religious photo or artwork on the wall. That's not a there, that's you, and that's fine. But I don't know if you want that to be part of your interview practice because you don't know who's interviewing you and what misconceptions, right? Everybody's judging whether it's right or wrong, and you don't want that to be part of the interview process. Make sure that, as in this picture, this person has just a shirt and tie. Ties aren't really as relevant as they were even 5, 10 years ago. By going into the company's website, by figuring out what the company's culture is, you can have a better idea of how to dress. And my suggestion is to dress a little bit above what the job says, would call for, what the normal attire for the job is. Lana, are there any questions?
Not at this time.
Okay.
Wait. Yeah, no. No, there's no questions. Thank you.
So yeah, remember, it's just really important to present yourself the best you can and as simply as you can. The selection interview, a lot of time is in person. It's very similar to the screening. Behavioral interviews are part, a lot of times, of the in-person screening, and they ask behavioral questions, which we'll talk about. Work sample will be if you're a welder, they might ask you to come in and do a weld. If you're going to be an instructor, they might ask you to come in and teach a class. If you're an artist, they might ask you for a portfolio of previous artwork. Also, a portfolio is not just for the creative type. You can always put together a portfolio if you've laid out a really incredible spreadsheet that was very effective for your last job and the job you're interviewing for talks about creating spreadsheets. You might not have it filled with information because that belongs to the company, but you might have the layout of it. Group interviews are when they have more than one candidate there and they ask questions, and it's not only how you're interacting with the panelists, but how you respond to the other people who are being interviewed. A peer interview might be going out for lunch. And it's all part of the interview process, and you should always be on your best behavior. So communicating your best image, right? You send a good signal, you're showing and telling, you finish strong, and you always follow up, right? So I like to say show and share instead of show and tell. Some interviews are more of a conversational interview than they are in the state. The policy is to have 2 to 3 people between 5 and 11 questions, and then they take turns asking those questions, and they don't respond to your answers. And you're given a certain amount of points based from 1 to 5 based on your answer. So there isn't a conversation. But in private industry, there could be a conversation. So you want to show and share, you want to engage the interviewer as well as showing off what you can do. You want to finish strong by answering questions, and you always want to follow. So there are multiple ways of handling the tough questions. And one of them is the sandwich method, where you start with a positive, You add in what the negative is, and then you always end with the positive because people remember more the beginning and the end. It's good to anticipate the questions and be prepared. And the way that you can be prepared is what we talked about at the beginning, where you take point by point what they're asking for in the job posting, and you have corresponding examples of how you have those skills, how you not only have those skills, but how you demonstrated those skills and what the results were of those skills. And always be positive and honest and keep it brief. You always want to answer, so you focus on the skills that are needed for the job that are talked about in the job posting. And so a lot of times at an interview, they'll say, we have 8 questions to ask you, right? And then you'll know that the interview is 45 minutes. So you need to pace yourself and you need to be respectful of their time because they might have only 15 minutes in between your interview and the next. And that happens more and more when interviews are virtual. You can get more people in. And a sandwich method is where you say, tell me a time when you had to work with a negative coworker. So we'll talk about tough questions that throw you in a minute. So tell me a time when you had to work with a negative coworker. And you can start with, you know, my coworkers at work they're all contributing and we seem to work together. Occasionally there are issues that cause tension. Sometimes that comes up when we have a very short deadline and there's a team member for one reason or another has not been able to do what they needed to do to make us have the team make the deadline. And so what we do as a group is we had a conversation about expectations, found out what was holding up the coworker from being able to meet the deadline. Many of the people on the team were able to step up and help. And the results was we were able to make the deadline and that the coworker who wasn't able to make the deadline learned that it was important to communicate any hiccups along the way so they could be addressed promptly. So I started with the positive, I said what the negative situation was, and I ended with a positive. If you are thrown a tough question that throws you, there's no shame in saying, I would like to come back to that question. It gives you time to think. If you're uncomfortable doing that, you can always repeat the question, and that gives you a little bit of time to think. One of the things that's sometimes nice to do at the beginning of the interview is ask if it's okay to take notes. And then if you've asked that question and you're asked a tough question or a question that throws you, then you can always say, is it okay if we come back to that question later? And then you write down the question, and while you're answering other questions, it might you might develop an answer to it. Is there any other questions, Lana, that came up that I missed?
Well, there is one question. It says, if a screener isn't necessarily familiar with the particular role's specifics, are there some do's and don'ts in terms of how deep you get into things? Is more focused on organizational fit? Keep the specific examples for showing how you fit the requirements concise, for example, and then it says question mark. So
So to summarize it, sometimes the phone screener is HR and they don't know about the tasks. So you want to talk more generally. And then save the specifics for the interview itself. Do you think that answers the question?
yeah, that answers the questions. That's basically what they're saying in there. That they may not be familiar. So you want to say the specific relators, but if they ask me a question that afforded me the opportunity to give some, I would give some because they may have a checklist. They may
Right,
not be familiar, but they may be assigned from the actual hiring manager saying, make sure they have these before I even see them. So that's a,
right. And you always have to keep that in consideration because the phone interview is phone screening is that's what it is. It's a screening. So you said you had this on your resume and reinforced it in your cover letter. How do you really have it? So if they ask you a question, even if they come across like they're not fully aware of the implications of that particular skill in the job, then you need to answer it specifically. So um, the, one of the best ways to answer questions is the STAR method. Situation, task, action, results. Because that gives you an opportunity to talk about an actual event or occurrence or task, job, situation that you had in a previous job. This this was going on. This was the task that I was assigned or I knew I had to do. These are the action or actions I took, and this was the results. The most important part of this question answer is the actions that you took, and even more important are the results. Because what they're looking for is you did X, Y, or Z for a previous employer and they benefited with it by this. Because I want to know how you can add to the team. How can you add to the bottom line? So even if you have a question like, tell me what is one of your weaknesses, right? So the situation, how I would answer this is, I had this impression that I was a procrastinator. That was the situation. The task was completing a job. So I had a deadline and I was in the past working up to that deadline. So most of the time I made it. Sometimes I was a little over. The task was how do I make sure that the job or the tasks are done in a timely manner? And one of the jobs I had was teaching soft skills to inmates at Stillwater Prison. We did an assessment called True Color, and you were one of four colors, and I landed squarely on green. And greens are very into knowledge, into research, into getting all the details, of knowing all the facts. What I realized was that I wasn't procrastinating. I just didn't have the information I needed or thought I didn't have the information I needed. I had to do one more interview. I had to ask one more question. I had to read one more book or article. I had to Google some more information. So what I did going forward was I had two deadlines. I had a deadline when I had to stop researching, and I had a deadline that was when the project was due. And the results was 9.5% of the time, I got projects done even before the deadline because I knew when to stop gathering information. So yeah, so the amount of detail that you go into should be minimal, especially since most interviews are a half hour to 45 minutes. You just want to give enough information so that your actions and the results make sense. And I wouldn't you don't do War and Peace. You do a 3 or 4 floor elevator, maybe 6 floor elevator speech. And you can use, so how many of you have been asked the question at the beginning of an interview, tell me about yourself? So it's a pretty standard practice. When you answer that question, they're not asking you if that you're the middle child of 12, your mother died when you were 7, you had to go to a community college because the family couldn't afford Harvard. What they're asking for is what skills you have that are germane to the job listing. So an answer would be, I'm a communication expert with over 5 years of experience, have done a lot of work in the nonprofit world, if that's germane to the job you're applying for. I really love building relationships and being able to get the word out about the programs that I'm working on, right? Short, sweet, applying to the job. They want to know how your background and who you are, your personality fits in with the job that you're applying for. That's what's important. So this STAR method can be used in many, many different situations. So tell me about yourself. Why are you interested in working for this company? That's where your research comes into play, right? I had a colleague who was once asked that question in a job interview, and she talked about how her values aligned with the company's mission statement. And somebody on the panel said, oh, I didn't even know that was part of our mission statement, right? So you can impress people with how detailed you are about your research. You can use this for a major weakness that I just showed, or one of your major strengths. One of my major strengths is connections, making connections with people. So the situation is there was a panel that was scheduled to be in our Career Force Center for Black people in the tech industry. And at the last minute, 4 days before the event was supposed to start, 3 of the 5 panelists canceled for one reason or another. I was able to fill those spots working my LinkedIn connections because I work on keeping connected with them, even tangentially, so that I'm not asking people out of the blue, out of the cold. And I was able to get 3 people to fill the panel based on the fact that I kept my connections going. And so I saw a question come up, Lana, that I missed.
Yeah, there are actually 2 questions. I'm gonna start with the latest one. The latest question is, if a recruiter has gotten you the interview, how do you answer the question why you're interested in this company?
So you should even know about the company. I mean, the recruiter got you the interview, but if you're not interested in the company, you should tell the recruiter you're not interested. You should be only interviewing at companies that you're interested in working at, and then you need to do the research. Even if a recruiter gets you the interview, you still need to do the research. And the next question.
You may have touched on this already. It says, how much background information should I give in these situational questions? I feel like if you go too in depth, but also feel like you need some information to understand the scenario. Any tips on how to sync that?
Right. So you give the minimal of detail. Think of it as an outline. Like when I was talking about my weakness, I didn't give any specific details about projects that I didn't make the deadline or that I was up against, excuse me, the wall with. I just said that it happened sometimes. What you want to do is spend the majority of your time on the actions that you took and what were the results. The results is really where you want to spend the most of your time. And you never ever want to talk negatively about anybody, coworker, boss, company, HR department. You always want to be positive and use judgmental adjectives or adverbs. There was a stressful situation. Not this coworker caused this stressful situation. So what was the question about 3 different directions?
Okay, so this question says, how do you answer interview questions? What would you do if you get work directions from 3 different supervisors?
Right. So hopefully you have a main supervisor, but if you don't, um, the thing is to get all three supervisors together if possible, lay out the tasks and the timeline, and let them help you prioritize. But I would always come to the meeting with, in reviewing the projects that I've been assigned and the timeline, this is how how a draft or how I would propose to use my time to meet these deadlines. Please, I would love input because some of this is conflicting. But that's a really hard situation to be in. And that if asked that question, that must be a true thing that happens at that company that has caused people to quit. So then there's the question about why did you leave your last job? Which is easier for some and harder for others. Has anybody been asked this question in interviews?
There's a lot of yeses. I don't see any no's yet.
Yep, a lot of it. So if you are asked this question, and the reason that you're not working at your previous employer is not a comfortable one, or there's some stress related, or some special circumstances, this is where you call and connect with your local career force center, because each situation is different. Each situation has its own nuances. You never say you quit. You never say you were fired. Those are givens. But how you communicate what actually happened is very nuanced, and it's very important that you connect with somebody who can listen to all the different parts that go with it. You do not have to give a lot of detail. One of the jobs that I had to leave was because the individual retired, right? Um, so all I had to say was the owner of the company retired, and the company that bought his business only took one of the 20 employees, right? Or another job was because the company reorganized, and my job was divided up between four other people, and my position no longer existed. So that's all I need to say. Or if you're looking for a job while you have a job, then you need to say, I'm looking for new I worked in this position for 4 years, and I would like to now largen my horizon and learn new skills, or that I learned while I was doing this job that I have a real passion for this, and it's a very small part of my job. And this position that I'm interviewing gives me an opportunity to work more closely on my passion. So those are just some examples, but the best thing you can do is connect with somebody at your Career Force Center, and make sure that they help you with that. Any questions that I missed?
No.
So you always want to end the interview with questions. So hopefully they'll ask you, do you have any questions? And the last question is a good thing to ask is, what are the next steps? What you're trying to find out is the timeline for hiring. And this helps you feel more comfortable if you don't hear back in a week, sending out an email. Just checking in, wanting to know where you are in the process of making a decision on this position. I'm still interested and excited about using my skills in this position. But if you ask the question, what is the timeline? Then you don't feel like you're nagging. Or can I connect with anybody after a certain amount of time to see where you are in the hiring process? Other questions you might ask, why is this position open? Oftentimes I'll see jobs that the same position is posted every 3 or 4 months. right? So are they adding that position, or for some reason, the people who take the job don't stay in the job? And you want to know that. If you find out if you find out by asking that the manager is hard to work with, then if you're offered the job, you might want feel comfortable saying, I'm sorry that I'm no longer interested in this opportunity. You might want to ask, what is a day in the life of this job? How, in a year, how will you know that the person in this position has been successful? What matrix is this position judged on? Things like that. But you always want to have at least 5 questions prepared. You might not ask all but maybe 1 or 2 of them, but you want to have more than you think is appropriate, just in case. And it also helps with dialogue, especially in state jobs where they ask there's a script. The only time to really interact with the panelists is afterwards when you ask questions. All right, before I go to follow up, is there any other questions about the interview process?
Um, Someone is asking, do you recommend probing questions that demonstrate an interest in the position of the company? Like why I have a like what haven't asked that would be good to know? What have I not asked that would be good to know? That's
Yep,
one question.
I think that's a good one.
Someone is asking, how do you find the local career force number? I'm going to provide that in a follow-up email.
Right.
And
Anything
it was
else?
there's a couple of things in here. It says there I guess people are sharing why they were no longer at the company as per you. We were talking about that particular inquiry. Why'd you leave your last job? And some of the answers are appropriate, and some of them are concerning. So, like if someone said they were fired or fired. So the people who said that they were fired, I'm gonna put a number into the chat so you can follow up with me later because we need to talk about that before your
Okay.
next interview.
Yeah, you should never ever say you were fired. That's one of those hard, not a good idea. Um, right. Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you, Madison. Yeah. Um, you need to remember in the previous slide, we said end strong, and you end strong by asking questions and show that you're engaged. I had an interview many, many, many years ago, and I asked the manager what was their management style, and they couldn't answer the question. So I did not get the job. Um, I think that question in hindsight put that person on the spot, which was not the intent. The reason I asked it was because I had had a micromanager in a previous position, and I didn't want to repeat that scenario. But in hindsight, it wasn't a good question to ask. Lesson learned. So, post-interview steps. While you're in the interview, get people's first and last names if possible. Sometimes it is a fair question. Sometimes it's if you're doing a virtual interview, it's on the screen. If you're doing it in person, hopefully people in the room have brought their business cards, but you want to be able to thank people afterwards. Um, you need to, before your interview, you need to have references, and you need to have references who know they are your references, right? So you never want to put anybody on the spot. who you do not check with ahead of time. That's really bad form in many ways. So you always want to ask people if they're willing to be your reference. You always want to get their most recent contact information. It might be somebody you worked with in the past who is no longer at that company and their email has changed or their phone number has changed. You always want to get that. After the interview, I suggest that you send to your references the job posting, the resume that you used, and the cover letter that you used, and recap in the email that you send these what was talked about in the interview so they know what of your skills that they're going to need to highlight. You also want to send a thank you note to everybody that was at the interview. You want to thank them for their time, bring up a point that was brought up in the interview, or if you remembered something, a story or a point that would have been good, you might want to do that. It is totally acceptable nowadays, and almost I'd like to say preferred, that you send an email. You can send a card, you can send a letter. Emails are much faster, and you don't know how fast they're making the hiring process. You will be 2 or 3 steps above other people if you send a thank you, because most people do not send thank yous. Most people don't do that. So it's a really good opportunity to sell yourself just one more time. So now we're going to go to questions. Are there any in the chat? You can ask an interviewer their last name. If you want, you can ask for their email address.
So you must be reading them too, because I'm not where you're at. I'm at the question that says, would it be a good response to say I was laid off due to economic change in the industry?
Right. So that might be the organization is a shorter way to say that, because that's what happens with an economic change. They're not bringing in enough money, so then they have to reorganize based on the income brought in.
Okay. This next one is it's not actually a question, it's a statement. Just had an interview, I thought I did well, and then they rejected me saying I didn't sound confident in my abilities. First, congratulations, because oftentimes we receive rejections and we have no idea why. So I'm very excited that you have been provided that information as far as the ability to sound confident. And I'm certain that we can help you at Career Force. So do contact us following this workshop. Sorry, Sandra. Okay.
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah.
Good, 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 good.
Yeah. And then the next one said, nope, that's the same one. I'm sorry. Someone asked the question, what is Career Force, which is one word, supposed to help with?
So Career Force is your one-stop shop, no matter what level you are, right? So there are professionals there who can help you with your job search. It might be just looking over your resume to see how how you can highlight your skills better. It could be practice interviewing. Sometimes the fact that you don't come off confidence is the words you choose. Instead of, you say, I'm really good at data entry. You might say, I have the ability to do data entry, but a better way to say that would be, I efficiently and correctly do data entry, right? So it's just a matter of choice of words. Women tend to come off less confident than men because they say things like, so, or I'm just wondering, or you use words that do not come off confident. That's something that someone at the Career Force Center can do. They can help you interview, they can ask you the question, you can respond, and they can tell you how you came across. Sometimes we have tics. We start every sentence with, okay, this is how I did it, right? Or you might twirl your hair while you're doing it, or scratch your beard. Those are little things that people note and come off like, maybe you're not confident. But your Career Force Center can help that. We also have dislocated worker. If you're not familiar with that, contact your Career Force Center. People, you could be eligible for funding to help you get certifications, to help you with your job search. They might help you direct. Um, we have job fairs, we go to job fairs, we know about employers who are hiring. What's great about connecting with your local Career Force Center is that they know about the jobs in your area and the employers in your area.
Okay, thank you. Let me see. So the next question is how do you send a thank you to the hiring manager if the interview was arranged through a hiring recruiter and you don't have that contact information? But I believe Sandra's answered that. Go ahead.
But you're talking to the hiring manager, right, in the interview? And so then you can ask them for their email. And if they ask why, they can say to send a thank you, right? Just be really upfront with it.
Then the next question is actually related to that is how soon after do you send this thank you?
24 hours.
At the end of the interview, always thank them for their
Yeah.
time. So that was a statement, sorry.
Yeah.
What are some red flags I should look out for that would tell me that I don't want to work for them?
Everybody has different red flags. Everybody has different red flags. Everybody tolerates different things. I had applied for a job a couple of years ago in August, and in the end of October, I got a call from the hiring manager to do a phone screening. And he didn't even know the title of the position that he was calling me for to screen. So I couldn't even look it up to know what I had to prep for, right? So, is that a red flag? Was that his fault that he was calling me almost 3 months later? Were there other circumstances? So you have to decide for yourself. And part of that question, I asked, so I applied for that job in August. He said HR was late in getting back to me. So then I learned that it wasn't his fault, right? Because I don't know if I want to work for a manager that doesn't get back to his employees until 3 months about a project, right? So you just have to decide that for yourself. Other questions?
Yeah, here's the salary questions. How should we answer the question about our desired salary? If the job posts the salary range, why can't I just ask for the highest amount?
Right. So you never, unless pressed, you don't want to talk about salary until you're offered the job. And then you know that they want you, and that's like the best time to do it. And that's where your research comes in. Because if you go to those sites and you find out the range and the experience, then it's easier to ask for a higher salary. And if your skill set for this position just meets the minimum requirement, you're not going to get the maximum salary asked for, right? You can, and the rule of thumb is to always ask for a little bit more than you'll accept, because then they'll come down to maybe what you'll accept. And also you need to look at other components of the job. Sometimes people negotiate for an extra week of vacation. Sometimes the health package, the health benefit package is really, really sweet. That all figures into the total salary. Maybe it's a parking space if you're working in downtown Minneapolis or St. Paul. There are different components that one can use in the negotiation.
Okay. Then it says, okay, that was it. That was just is one question is it better to set up an interview on your own or go through a recruiter or an agency?
So every industry is different, and none of those are better than the other. Um, what you should never do is if a recruiter offers you a job, tells you about a job, to reach out on your own to the hiring manager. You never want to work behind the recruiter's back. So if you decide to go with a recruiter, then you need to work with them. And there's no sin in telling a recruiter that you're no longer interested in working with them, right? If they don't produce, if you're not getting the quality of jobs you want, then you can go on to another recruiter. Um, they're part of the interview process just like you are. And part of the job hunt is figuring out what works for you and what works for your industry.
Okay, then the next one is I applied for, this is a statement. Okay, it says I applied for a position where they asked my salary requirement in the online form and it was a required field. They had given a range for the job posting. What would you say to that required question?
Right, and that is on the state job. Also, when you apply for a state job, they ask you your minimum salary requirement. So you put in your minimum. Doesn't mean that they're going to offer you that. It just means that's your minimum. And it could be the middle of the range, but you always need to be realistic, right? You need to do it based on your experience because if you're if this is a new type of position for you and just you're trying to get move up in an organization or into a job title, then you're not going to ask for the top, right? You need to do it in the middle. If there are no other questions, we can end early. I just want to reiterate that you can never be over prepared for an interview. You really need to do your research. You need to know the company, you need to know what the job posting said in detail, and you need to know how, from your past experience, you are a good fit for this job. If you get the interview, you meet the minimum requirements. So you need to sell yourself. Think of yourself as a candy bar, right? Why do you pick up one chocolate bar on the shelf over another? And you need to think of yourself, which is kind of bizarre, as a commodity, right? Why would you be a good fit for this team? And you have to sell that with your energy, with your positive attitude, with how prepared you are to answer questions, and the fact that you have questions to answer at the end. And always send a thank you. Always thank people at the end of the interview for their time, and then say it again in a note. Any last minute questions, Lana, before we say goodbye?
Uh, there was one question. Oh, now they're starting to say thank you. Hold on, I lost my place. 1 second here. It says for the industry specific career positions, how do you answer the question of why you want to leave your current job if you've only been working at that job for a few months?
So that's again where you would go to the Career Force Center, and they would help you answer that, because one of the things that would be a concern for the people interviewing you is, all right, so you had this job for a couple months, you thought you wanted it, you left, and so now why do I believe that you would stay at our place for longer? Because hiring somebody and training somebody costs money to a company. So you need to work through that with somebody at a career force center, because there are details about why you left um, that might help in explaining that. And I've worked with a lot of school teachers who are burnt out and want to work in other industries. And it's just simply that you're ready for a career change. You have these skills, you develop them. At this point in time, you realize that you would like another challenge. And that's easier to say if you've been at a job for 1, 2, or 10 years than if you were only there a couple months. All righty. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. And you can always reach out. Lana will send you a whole bunch of information. And check out the other workshops and check out careerforcemn.com. Great resources there, things that you can use. And please connect with your local career force center. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the winter weather.